At the dawn of the 20th century, the world was a simple place if you were a European power. You had the big empires, and then you had everyone else. In one corner, we have the Russian Empire, a sprawling, gigantic nation led by Tsar Nicholas II, a man who believed autocracy was a divine gift and that his armies were invincible. Russia needed a warm water port in the Pacific for its navy and trade, a place that didn't freeze over in winter. They had their eyes greedily fixed on Manchuria and Korea, and they'd leased the strategic Port Arthur from China. In the other corner, there's Japan. 50 years prior, they were a feudal society with samurai. Now, after the Meiji Restoration, they were industrializing at a terrifying speed. Still, in the minds of the Russian court, they were just little monkeys, an amusing, developing nation that should know its place. This wasn't just overconfidence, it was a level of dismissive prejudice that makes for fantastic historical drama. Japan, having recently won its own war against China, felt Port Arthur was rightfully in its sphere of influence. They had, after all, captured it in 1895. But then Russia, along with Germany and France, stepped in with the triple intervention, politely advising Japan to give it back. A few years later, Russia just takes it for themselves. The diplomatic equivalent of stealing someone's lunch money after forcing them to put it on the table. Japan tried to negotiate. They proposed a deal. Russia could have Manchuria if Japan could have Korea. A straightforward quid pro quo. Russia's response was, essentially, to leave them on raid. They stalled, delayed, and continued moving troops into Manchuria, assuming Japan would eventually just give up. On February 6, 1904, Japan recalled its ambassador. It was over. The talking part, anyway. The Russians were genuinely shocked. They hadn't believed Japan would actually have the nerve to do anything about it. 2 days later, on the night of February 8, 1904, the Japanese Imperial Navy showed up to Port Arthur. The Russian Pacific Fleet was anchored peacefully in the outer harbor. They felt so secure, they didn't even have torpedo nets deployed. Some ships still had their lights on. It was less a military base and more a naval parking lot. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's destroyers launched a surprise torpedo attack. It wasn't a decisive blow, but it crippled several of Russia's best ships, including the battleships Tsesarevich and Retvitsan. The Russian commander was so unprepared he was literally at a party hosted by his wife. When the explosions were heard, he reportedly assured his guests it was just target practice. Superb situational awareness. This move, attacking before a formal declaration of war, was seen as sneaky, but it was also brutally effective. Japan had seized the initiative while Russia was still pouring champagne. With the Russian fleet bottled up, Japan landed troops on the Korean peninsula and pushed into Manchuria. The main event on land became the siege of Port Arthur. This is where the 19th century met the 20th in the worst way possible. We're talking trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, and massive artillery. The Japanese commander, General Nogi Marisuke, was a man of tradition. His tradition, apparently, was sending thousands of men on suicidal frontal assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. The casualties were astronomical. At one position, 203-meter hill, the Japanese lost over 14,000 men, taking a piece of ground they needed for their artillery spotters. The Russians inside weren't having a great time either, slowly starving under the command of the spectacularly incompetent General Stoessel. He would eventually surrender the fortress in January 1905, a move for which he was later sentenced to death back in Russia. The sentence was commuted, of course. Incompetence on that scale apparently loops back around to being impressive. With the Pacific Fleet neutralized, St. Petersburg initiated Plan B, and Plan B was completely, certifiably insane. They decided to send their Baltic Fleet, renamed the 2nd Pacific Squadron, on an 18,000 nautical mile journey around the world to save the day. This epic voyage was led by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a man who seemed to be powered by sheer fury. Just off the coast of Great Britain, in an incident known as the Dogger Bank Incident, his fleet encountered British fishing trawlers. In a fit of paranoia, they mistook them for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire, sinking a trawler and killing British fishermen. This almost started a war with the British Empire, who promptly denied them access to the Suez Canal. So they had to go the long way around Africa. The ships were old, the crews were inexperienced, and morale was plumbing new depths with every lump of coal they had to handload in the middle of the ocean. After 7 agonizing months, the Baltic Fleet finally reached the waters near Japan. They were exhausted, their ships were fouled, and their gunnery was terrible. Waiting for them in the Tsushima Strait was Admiral Togo and the Japanese fleet. His ships were faster, his crews were battle-hardened veterans, and his gunners were terrifyingly accurate. Togo executed a legendary maneuver, the Togo Turn, a risky U-turn that brought his fleet directly across the path of the advancing Russians. This is called crossing the T. It allowed his entire fleet to fire their broadside cannons at the front of the Russian column, which could only fire its forward-facing guns in return. The result wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The brand new Russian battleships, the pride of the Tsar, were systematically annihilated. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and only a handful escaped. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history, and it took less than 24 hours. The defeat at Tsushima was the final nail in the coffin. Russia couldn't continue. But here's the twist. Japan couldn't really either. Winning was proving to be incredibly expensive. The country was basically bankrupt. So both sides secretly wanted out. The United States, under President Theodore Roosevelt, stepped in to mediate. The negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because nothing says East Asian conflict resolution like the American Northeast. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth gave Japan control of Korea and the southern half of Sakhalin Island, but critically, it included no war reparations. The Japanese public, who had been told they were winning a glorious total victory, was furious. Riots broke out in Tokyo. The Russians felt humiliated by the territorial losses. Nobody was happy. Except for Teddy Roosevelt, who got a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a deal that both participants hated. Classic. So why does this war, fought over a century ago, even matter? Because its outcome completely rewired the 20th century. For the first time in the modern era, a non-European nation had defeated a great European power. The myth of inherent white Western superiority was shattered. Anti-colonial movements from Vietnam to India took note. For Japan, the victory was intoxicating. It supercharged their imperial ambitions and militarism, setting them on a path that would lead directly to Manchuria in the 30s, China, and eventually Pearl Harbor. For Russia, the humiliation was a catalyst. The disastrous war effort led directly to the 1905 revolution, a dress rehearsal for the big show in 1917 that would end the Tsarist regime for good. This wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a global turning point disguised as a spat over a port. The entire world order tilted on the axis of this one seemingly remote and brutally fought war. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!